She didn't cry when he denied her. That was the part nobody expected. Amara Cole stood in the middle of a restaurant full of people she'd known for 3 years, coworkers, his friends, her friends, and she watched the man she'd spent 2 years loving look her dead in the eye and say, "I don't really know her like that." Just like that. Like she was a stranger. Like she hadn't cooked in his kitchen on Sunday mornings. Like she hadn't sat in hospital waiting rooms with his mother. Like her laugh wasn't the thing he said he fell asleep thinking about on long nights. I don't really know her like that. 7 words, and not one tear fell from her eyes. She picked up her bag. She smoothed the front of her dress, the burgundy wrap dress she'd bought specifically for this dinner because he'd once told her that color was his favorite on her. She said excuse me to no one in particular, stepped around the server who was pretending not to have heard, and walked out of that restaurant with her spine straight. She didn't look back. She would not give him, or any of them, the satisfaction of watching her break. That would happen later, alone, in the bathroom of her own apartment, with the shower running so her neighbors couldn't hear. His name was Darius Webb, and he was the kind of man women warned each other about in hindsight, charming, attentive in the beginning, the type who made you feel like the most interesting person in the room, until someone more useful walked in and suddenly you were furniture. She'd met him at a work event 2 years ago. He'd laughed at something she said, and it had been so genuine, so warm, that she'd let her guard down in a way she rarely did. She was guarded by nature, not cold, just careful. She'd learned early that the world wasn't always kind to women who looked like her, who were built like her, who took up space the way she did. So she'd made herself palatable, smaller, easier to swallow. Darius had seemed different. For a while he was. But then the comments started. Small ones at first. You'd look even better if you... Or I think you'd feel more confident if you just... And she'd smiled and redirected and tried not to hear what was underneath them because underneath them was the same message she'd been hearing her whole life. You're too much. You're almost right. You'd be perfect if you were just a little less. The dinner tonight was supposed to be a public declaration. That's what he'd told her. I want everyone to see us together. She'd been stupid enough to believe him. Instead, she'd walked into a setup. His new girlfriend, younger, lighter, quieter, was already seated at the table. And when Amara had stood there in her burgundy dress with confusion written across her face, Darius had looked right at her and said those 7 words. I don't really know her like that. And his new girlfriend had smiled, politely, not knowing any of it. Amara went home. She packed 2 bags, just the essentials, the things that were hers and only hers. She left behind the houseplants she'd been tending for 8 months because they'd been a gift from him, and she didn't want anything that still carried his energy. She left the throw blankets. She left the kitchen gadgets. She left the framed photo on the bookshelf that she'd always thought was a little crooked anyway. She sat on the edge of her bed with the 2 packed bags at her feet, and she opened her phone and looked up bus schedules. She didn't have a destination in mind at first. She just needed to be somewhere that didn't know her name. Somewhere that didn't carry the memory of the last 2 years. Somewhere that couldn't look at her with the particular expression she'd been seeing on people's faces all night. That mixture of pity and relief, like they'd been waiting for this to happen and were glad they could finally stop pretending it wasn't going to. She picked the farthest city on the list that she could afford a ticket to tonight. Haiju. It was a port city, industrial, gritty, not particularly known for anything except its shipping district and its underground economy. Things she'd read in passing and hadn't thought twice about. She didn't know anyone there. No one knew her there. That was enough. She bought the ticket, zipped up her bags, and at 11:47 p.m., she walked out of her apartment without turning the lights off. She didn't know she was walking toward the most dangerous man in the city. She didn't know she was walking toward the first person who would ever see her clearly. She didn't know any of that yet. She just walked. Haeju at 6 a.m. looked like a city that hadn't decided yet what kind of day it was going to have. The port was already loud. Cranes, trucks, men shouting to each other in the gray morning fog. The streets near the bus terminal smelled like salt and diesel and something fried coming from a vendor who'd set up his cart before the sun finished rising. Pigeons argued on a concrete ledge. Amara sat on a bench outside the terminal with her 2 bags beside her and watched the city wake up. She had enough money for 3 weeks if she was careful. She had a phone, a portable charger, a folder of documents, and approximately zero plan. She was 31 years old and she had just walked away from the entirety of her life in a city that no longer wanted her, and she felt, strangely, surprisingly, almost calm. Not okay. She wasn't okay, but calm. She found a motel 6 blocks from the terminal that rented by the week and didn't ask many questions. The woman at the front desk handed her a key without looking up from her phone. The room was small, clean enough, with a window that faced a brick wall and a radiator that hummed. She sat on the bed and let herself cry for exactly 22 minutes. Then she washed her face. Aker made a list and started looking for work. She found the job posting on a bulletin board. Actual paper, actually pinned, at a corner laundromat where she'd gone to wash the clothes from her bags. Front desk administrator, logistics coordination, Haeju operations group. Immediate start. Professional, discreet candidates preferred. The address was on the edge of the port district. She called the number. A man with a clipped, efficient voice asked her 3 questions. Could she keep a schedule? Could she stay calm under pressure? Did she have any connections in the city? She said yes, yes, and no. He told her to come in the next morning. She didn't think too hard about the word discreet. She needed money, and she needed something to do with her hands and her mind. She would figure out the rest. The building was unremarkable from the outside. Gray concrete, metal doors, a small brass plaque that said Hog Logistics, and nothing else. Inside, it was organized in the way that places with a lot of moving parts tend to be organized. Everything had a designated place, everything moved on a schedule, and the people who worked there had the particular kind of focused quiet that came from understanding that their job required precision. She would figure out over the next 2 weeks that Hog Logistics was, on the surface, a legitimate port-side shipping coordination company. She would figure out that below the surface it was significantly more complicated than that. She would figure out that the building she sat in every day from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. was one piece of a much larger operation. But that came later. On her first morning, she just sat at the front desk, learned the filing system in 2 hours, reorganized the digital schedule in 3, and was finishing a rerouted shipping manifest before lunch. The man who'd interviewed her, broad-shouldered 40s named Mr. O, came to check on her mid-morning and stopped when he saw what she'd done to the scheduling board. He looked at it for a long moment. He said, "No one asked you to do that." She said, "I know, it needed to be done." He looked at her for another moment. Then he nodded and walked away. She didn't see the man at the end of the hallway who had paused in the act of reading a report to watch the exchange. She wouldn't notice him for another 3 days. His name was Kangjun Seo, not that anyone said it casually. Not that most people in the building said it at all. He existed in the space the way a weather system exists. You knew he was there by how people adjusted themselves around him, how the temperature of the room changed, how voices dropped and postures straightened and eyes moved to their work with sudden, renewed focus. He was tall for a Korean man and still, deeply, unnervingly still, in the way that men who have never needed to perform their authority tend to be still. His face was the kind of face that didn't give anything away. Not cold exactly, but controlled, the way a fire is controlled when it's been built inside something designed to contain it. He had been running the Haeju syndicate for 7 years. He had taken it over at 26 when the previous leader made the catastrophic mistake of assuming that quiet meant weak. Kangjun Seo had not raised his voice during that transition. He hadn't threatened anyone. He'd simply made a series of decisions, one after the other, and when the dust settled, the city understood that there was a new architecture in place, and he was the one holding the blueprints. He was not violent in the way that lesser men in his position were violent. Violence, he believed, was the resort of people who'd run out of better options. He preferred to make better options obsolete before anyone thought to use them. He was feared without being theatrical about it. And he noticed Amara Cole on her 3rd day. She was at her desk when 2 of the younger men in the office, runners, peripheral, trying to prove something to each other, made a comment as they passed her. She didn't fully hear it. She heard the tone, though, and she heard the particular register of men deciding collectively to be smaller than they actually were, directing that smallness at someone they'd decided was safe to aim it at. She set down her pen. She looked at them, not with anger, not with distress, with the specific kind of level attention that said, "I see you clearly and I'm not impressed." And she said very calmly, Say it again, and I'll file it. They blinked. File what? One of them said. Whatever it is, she said. I'll write it down, I'll date it, and I'll put it in the HR folder that Mr. O reviewed last Tuesday. I don't make threats. I just keep records. There was no HR folder. There was no review. But they didn't know that. They left. She picked up her pen and went back to work. At the end of the hallway, inside an office with glass walls that were frosted at eye level, Kangjun Seo had watched the entire exchange. He said nothing. He didn't move. He just watched her return to her work with the same composure she'd had when she arrived. That evening, he told Mr. O, "Don't let her leave." Mr. O raised an eyebrow. "She's good," Jun Seo said. That was all. 3 weeks passed. Amara settled into Haiju the way water settles into a new container. She found its edges, its rhythms, its particular gravity. She found a better room in a building closer to the port that was quieter than the motel. She found a market 2 blocks from the office where the vegetables were fresh and cheap. She found a route home that took her along the water, and she started walking it every evening because the sound of it helped her think. She was beginning to understand the shape of the organization she worked for. She wasn't naive. She'd known within the first week that Hog Logistics was not purely a logistics company. The pattern of shipments, the meetings that happened in conference rooms with no minutes taken, the men who came and went through the back entrance that was never on the official schedule. The way the building shifted register entirely after 7 p.m. She wasn't afraid. She was. And she took time to sit with this, to be honest with herself about it. Cautious, but not afraid. Because whatever else was happening in this building, no one had come for her. No one had asked her to do anything she wasn't prepared to do. She was scheduling, filing, coordinating, managing the front-facing operation with quiet competence, and in return she was paid well and left alone. She could do that. What she couldn't do was pretend she didn't notice the man at the end of the hallway. He came to her desk for the first time on a Tuesday. He set a file on her desk and said, without preamble, "This needs to be reorganized by port code, not date." She looked at the file. She looked up at him. She said, "It'll take me about 40 minutes. He nodded. He started to walk away. She said, "The date system is easier to cross-reference against the live schedule. If I reorganize by port code, you'll need a separate index to correlate. Do you want me to build that or work around it?" He stopped. He turned around. He looked at her the way she'd noticed he looked at everything. Fully, without hurry, like he was reading something that required complete attention. "Build it," he said. It'll take longer than 40 minutes. "Then take the time you need." He left. She built the index. It took 2.5 hours. When she put it on his desk, he read through it without speaking, and then he looked at her and said, "Good." That was the beginning. It happened gradually, the way trust happens when 2 careful people are involved. Not a door swinging open, but a series of small windows unlocking. He started asking her opinion on things, not personal things, operational things. The best routing for a split shipment when weather closed the southern dock. The most efficient way to restructure the weekly meeting schedules when 2 key contacts moved their availability. Whether a particular vendor's pattern of delays indicated unreliability or external interference. She answered him honestly and without hedging. When she didn't know, she said she didn't know and told him how she'd find out. When she had an opinion, she gave it plainly without dressing it up to be more palatable than it was. He listened. That surprised her more than anything. Not that he asked, but that he listened. Actually listened, not the performed listening of someone waiting for a pause to insert their own conclusion. Real listening, the kind that changed what came next. She noticed also that he was tired. Not in a way that showed on his face. His face remained what it always was, contained, unreadable to most. But she'd been watching people her whole life the way she'd had to watch them, carefully, looking for the signal under the signal. And what she saw in Kangjun Seo was the particular exhaustion of a person who had been holding something enormous for a very long time without putting it down. She didn't comment on it. She just adjusted. When he came to her with something in the late afternoon, she didn't rush him. She let the space be what it needed to be. She made a second cup of tea some evenings and left it on the edge of his desk without remark, the way you'd leave a window open for air without making a production of it. He never thanked her for the tea. He never stopped drinking it. It was on a Wednesday evening, the building mostly empty, just the skeleton night crew on the floor below, that they had the conversation that changed the shape of what was between them. She had stayed late to finish a rerouting project that had become more complex than expected, and he was in his office. The hallway was quiet. At some point, she became aware of him standing in the doorway, watching her work. She said without looking up, "I'll be done in 15 minutes." He said, "Take your time." She looked up then. He wasn't watching her with the operational attention he usually had. He was watching her with something else, something that was harder to categorize. She said, "You look like someone with something to say." He said after a moment, "You're not afraid of this place?" She considered that. She said, "Should I be? Most people are. Most people have more to lose." Something shifted in his expression, not softened. He didn't soften, but something in the architecture of his face rearranged itself slightly, like a window shutter adjusted by a few degrees. He said, "What happened? Before you came here?" She put down her pen. She looked at him. She said, "A man decided I didn't exist in a room full of people who believed him." A long pause. Jun Seo said, "What did you do?" "I left. And came here." "And came here," she agreed. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He was wrong." She held his gaze. There was nothing performative about what he'd said. No comfort in it, no charm, just a plain declaration, stated like a fact. She said, "I know." "Do you?" She thought about it, honestly thought about it. The burgundy dress, the 7 words, the bathroom floor, the 2 packed bags. The specific way humiliation could become a kind of room you kept living in even after you'd physically left it. She said, "Some days more than others." He nodded, like that was the only honest answer, and he was glad she'd given it instead of the easy one. He went back to his office. She finished her work. Neither of them said goodnight. But something had been established between them that was harder to name than good night and more significant than anything that had been said before. She became something she hadn't anticipated becoming in a place like this. Necessary. Not just useful. Necessary. The kind of necessary that gets noticed from outside. And that was where the danger came from. His name was Yoon Tae-yang, and he was the kind of man who watched for weaknesses the way other people watched for opportunity, because to him, they were the same thing. He ran a competing operation 2 districts over, smaller than Jun Seo's, hungrier, always looking for a lever. He started by watching her. Then he started sending people to the front desk with non-existent inquiries, just to get a read on what she knew and how she handled herself. She noticed the pattern on the 3rd inquiry. She said nothing about it to anyone yet. She just started keeping notes, dates, names, questions asked, responses given. She built a quiet file the same way she built all her files, precisely without fanfare. When she brought the file to Jun Seo, he read it in silence for 4 minutes. Then he set it down and looked at her. "You didn't tell me as they were happening," he said. "I didn't have enough yet," she said. "I wanted to be sure before I used your time." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're not being careful enough," when he said, "about your own safety." She said, "I'm careful enough." Amara. It was the first time he'd used her name. I'm just her name. No title, no preamble. Her name in his voice, quiet and direct. She felt the weight of it. She said, "I'm not going to disappear myself again, Jun Seo. I did that for 2 years and it didn't protect me from anything. It just made me smaller." He was still. She said, "If someone's watching me, I want to know why. I'm not going to pretend I don't see what I see to make someone else more comfortable." "That's not what I'm asking." "Then what are you asking?" He said slowly, "I'm asking you to let me know when something threatens you, before you've compiled the whole case." She absorbed that. She said, "So you can do what?" He said, "So I can make sure it doesn't reach you." The room was very quiet. She said, "I don't need protection. I need to not be kept in the dark." He said after a pause, "Oh, then we do both." Yoon Tae-yang escalated. Not dramatically. He wasn't theatrical about it. But one of his men caught up to her during her evening walk along the port, the route she took every night, which she understood now she should probably vary, and stood in her way with the particular kind of deliberate casualness that meant it wasn't casual. He said, "Mr. Yoon would like you to know that the position you're in has limited security. He's offering something more stable." She looked at the man. She took her time looking at him. She said, "Tell Mr. Yoon that I manage my own employment decisions." He said, "He thought you might say that. He also wanted me to tell you that Kangjun Seo isn't the kind of man who holds on to things." She held the man's gaze without expression. She said, I'll pass that along." She walked home along a different route. She sat in her room and felt the fear. Let herself feel it, actually, because she wasn't going to pretend it wasn't there. Her hands weren't entirely steady when she poured her water, but she didn't run. She was done running. She pulled out her phone and she called Jun Seo's number, the direct one he'd given her 2 weeks ago with no explanation. And when he picked up, she said, "Someone from Yoon's operation stopped me tonight. Here's what was said." And she told him. All of it. Plainly, directly, before she'd compiled any file. There was a silence on the other end that had a particular quality to it. Not emptiness, but the silence of something containing itself. He said, "Go inside. Lock your door." She said, "I'm already inside." He said, "Don't walk that route again." She said, "I know." Another silence. He said, "Amara." She said, "I'm fine." He said, "I know you are." And then, "I'm going to handle this." Jun Seo. She kept her voice steady. "Don't do anything that... I'm not asking you to do anything dangerous on my behalf." And he said, "You're not asking me to do anything. I'm deciding." And he ended the call. She didn't see him for 2 days. The building was tense in his absence. Not panicked, because this organization didn't panic, but there was an atmosphere of heightened attention, people moving with an extra layer of precision. Mr. O checked on her twice without explanation. She understood what that meant. She kept working. On the third morning, Jun Seo came back. He looked the same as he always did. But she'd gotten good at reading the small things. And she could see that whatever had happened in 2 days had cost him something. Not regret. Exhaustion. He didn't go to her desk. He went to his office. At noon, she brought him food from the market. Rice, braised fish, the kind of meal she'd watched him buy for himself when he thought no one was paying attention. And she set it on the edge of his desk and said nothing. He looked at it. He looked at her. He said, "You made this?" She said, "I bought it. I'm not going to pretend I made it." Something happened to his face then that she'd never seen happen before. It was small, barely a shift. But she caught it. The controlled surface of him cracked open for just a moment, and what was underneath wasn't scary. It was just tired, and human, and alone. He said, "Sit down." She sat. He said, "Yoon won't bother you again." She said, "What happened?" He said, "Nothing that needs to involve you." She said, "Jun Seo." He looked at her. She said, "I'm not asking because I'm afraid. I'm asking because I don't want to be kept outside of what concerns me. That's what I said before, and I meant it." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "There was a conversation. The terms were made clear. Yoon understands the limits now." She said, "And in exchange?" His jaw shifted slightly. He said, "In exchange, Yoon's operation gets one new shipping corridor through the South Dock, controlled, with my oversight." She absorbed that. She said, "You gave him something you didn't want to give." He said, "I gave him something that cost me less than the alternative." She said, "The alternative being?" He held her gaze. He said, "The alternative being you leaving." The room was very quiet. She said slowly, "That's what was at stake?" He said, "For me." She felt the weight of those 2 words settle into the room. For me. Not for the operation. Not for the position. For him. Personally. She said, "You should have told me that before you went." He said, "I know." She said, "I'm not something to be managed, Jun Seo. Not by you, not by anyone." "I know," he said again, and this time there was something in it. Acknowledgement. Real acknowledgement. Not the kind that was just an agreement to end a conversation. She said, "Then act like it." He said, "I will." The confrontation came 3 weeks later, and it wasn't Yoon this time. It was someone from Jun Seo's own circle, a senior contact, a man named Kwon who'd been aligned with the organization for over a decade, Anj who'd been watching the shifts in the operation's internal gravity and had drawn his own conclusions about what they meant. Kwon came to the building on a Friday afternoon with two of his men. He came to the front desk. He didn't speak to her disrespectfully. He was too careful for that. He just asked with elaborate politeness to speak to Jun Seo about certain recent arrangements. Amara told him Mr. Kang was unavailable. Kwon smiled and said, "Perhaps you could let him know that people are beginning to notice that his judgment has become personal." She looked at him. He said, "A man in his position can't afford distractions. You understand?" She said, "I'll let him know you stopped by." He held her gaze for a moment, looking for something, reading her, trying to find the place where she'd bend. He didn't find it. Aki nodded and left. She didn't feel frightened. She felt furious. Not because of the threat to herself. She'd made her peace with the reality of the world she was moving through. She felt furious because of the particular message being sent. Your presence is a problem. Your existence in this space is a liability. The man who sees you will pay for seeing you. She'd been that message her entire life, phrased in 100 different ways. And she was done. She walked down the hallway. She knocked on the office door. She went in. Jun Seo was on a call. He looked at her. He ended the call without explanation to whoever was on the other end. She said, "Kwon was just here." He said, "I know, I saw." She said, "He said people think your judgment has become personal." "It has," he said. She stopped. He said it so plainly, not defensively, not carefully, just said it. She said, "That's going to cost you." He said, "Probably, me." She said, "And?" He said, "And I've decided it's worth it." She held his gaze. She said, "Don't decide it's worth it because of me. Decide it's worth it because it's the right thing and you know it's the right thing." He said, "Those aren't different things." She stood in the middle of his office for a long moment. The city was visible through the glass. The port, the cranes, the gray water, the strange, ordinary machinery of a city that conducted its real business below its visible surface. She said, "What are you deciding exactly?" He said, "I'm deciding to stop protecting you quietly." She said, "And start?" He said, "Start protecting you openly." She understood what that meant. In a world like this, public was everything. Private was deniable. And public was a declaration. Public was putting your own name beside someone else's in a way that said, "What happens to her happens to me." She said, "That's a significant thing." He said, "Yes." She said, "I'm not asking you to." He said, "I know you're not asking." She said, "I don't need." He said, "I know you don't need it." He stood. He was very still, in the way he was always still, but there was something different in it now. Not controlled for the sake of concealment, but steady for the sake of clarity. He said, "This isn't about what you need. I know who you are and what you can survive. You've made that clear. This is about what I'm choosing, and I'm choosing to be known as the man who stands next to you." The room was completely quiet. She said, "Oh, why?" He said, "Because you are the only place I have ever been able to put something down." She felt that land in the center of her chest. She said, "That's..." He said, "I know what it is. I've been careful my whole life. I know the cost of being careless, and I'm still choosing this." She looked at him for a long time. She said, "Then we do it properly." He said, "Yes." The following Friday, Kwon returned. He came with a larger group this time, more theater, more weight. He came into the main floor of the building, which was unusual, which meant he wanted an audience. The people who worked there, the men who operated out of this building, the shift workers and the runners and the senior contacts who happened to be in, they all registered his arrival the particular way it was staged. He was there to make a point. He was there to make it publicly. Amara was at her desk. She didn't stand. She didn't move away. She continued what she was doing, entering a manifest into the system, her movement steady, and she felt the room's attention tighten like a cable pulled taut. Kwon approached the desk. He said, with the elaborate courtesy of someone who wanted witnesses to the tone of what he was about to do, "I wonder if I might speak with you a moment." She said, without looking up from the screen, "You have 30 seconds. Kwon smiled. He looked around at the room. He let the smile carry the message he wanted it to carry. See? She thinks she has standing here. Isn't that something? He said, I just want to ask for your sake, whether you've thought carefully about the position you're in, the world you're part of now, the expectations of the people in it. He paused. He said, a woman like you in a place like this? The room went quiet. Not gradually, immediately, because the door at the end of the hall had opened. Kangjun Seo walked through the room. He walked without hurry. He didn't look at Kwon. He didn't look at the assembled men. He walked to the front desk, and he stood beside Amara Cole's desk, and he turned to face the room. And he said, into the silence, she is with me. 3 words. But in this room, in this world, in this city, everyone who was standing there knew what those 3 words meant. They weren't a declaration of romance, though they were that too. They were a declaration of alignment, of position, of consequence. They meant any action directed at her is an action directed at me. Any disrespect offered to her is disrespect offered to me. Any harm contemplated for her will find its answer in me. Kwon's smile didn't disappear entirely, but it became a different kind of smile. Smaller, recalculated. He said, I see. Jun Seo said nothing more. He didn't need to. He stood beside her desk and let the silence do the rest of the work. Kwon left. His men followed. The room slowly returned to its business. The sounds of keyboards, low conversation, the business of the day resuming. The way rooms do when a weather system has passed through and the air has changed and everyone has recalibrated to the new temperature. Jun Seo didn't move immediately. He stayed beside her. Amara looked up from her screen. She looked at him standing there, this man who had not raised his voice, who had not threatened, who had not made a scene. And she felt something she hadn't felt in so long, it took her a moment to identify it. She felt seen, not observed, not assessed, not tolerated, seen. Completely. As she was, where she was, at the size she actually occupied in the world. She said quietly so only he could hear. You could have just sent a message. He said just as quietly, I know. She said, you came to the floor instead. He said, I wanted to be standing next to you when I said it. She held his gaze. She said, I'm still not going to pretend I need saving. He said, I know that. That's not what this was. She said, then what was it? He said, a choice. Mine. Made publicly. She understood. That was the difference. And that was the specific thing that made this different from every version of being protected she'd ever been offered. The ones that came with conditions, with requirements to be smaller or quieter or more grateful. The ones that required her to disappear into someone else's version of who she should be. This was a man choosing to stand beside her. Not in front of her, not for her. Beside her. And he hadn't asked her to change a single thing to make it possible. The aftermath was quiet, the way only real things are quiet. No celebration, no dramatic resolution. The organization absorbed the new reality. Kwon fell in line because Kwon was ultimately practical, and the practical reality was now obvious, and life continued in the way that life does. Amara still walked to the market. She still reorganized the things that needed reorganizing. And she still brought Jun Seo his tea in the late afternoon without fanfare and without expecting comment. He still drank it. Some evenings they sat in his office, not saying much, sometimes saying nothing, comfortable with the specific silence that only 2 careful people who've decided to trust each other can build. She talked to her sister, eventually. Called her for the first time in months, on a Sunday morning from her window overlooking the port. Her sister said, You sound different. Amara said, I feel different. Her sister said, Good different or bad different? She looked out at the water, the cranes, the gray ordinary morning. She said, Like I took up the right amount of space finally. Her sister went quiet for a moment, then she said, Tell me everything. She did not become someone else. And that was the thing that mattered, and the thing she held onto on the days when the old habit came back, the familiar gravitational pull towards smallness. She had to hold onto it deliberately, like a key. I did not become someone else. I became more entirely myself. Her body was the same. Her voice was the same. Her tendency to notice things before other people noticed them was the same. Her quiet was the same. Her occasional sharpness was the same. The difference was not in her. The difference was in whether she apologized for it. She stopped apologizing for it. She stopped waiting for permission to take up the space she took up. She stopped preemptively making herself palatable. She stopped reading the room to gauge whether she was too much, and she started reading the room to understand what it needed from her. Which was a different question and led to different answers. The city stopped being a thing that happened to her and started being a place she lived. That, in the end, was the whole thing. That was what she'd walked across the country for, even if she hadn't known it when she packed 2 bags and left the lights on. Not Jun Seo, not safety, not the specific warmth of being chosen by someone who understood the cost of choosing her. Those things were real. Those things mattered. She wasn't going to pretend otherwise, but they were additions, not foundations. The foundation was this. She had learned in a city that didn't know her name, in a building she hadn't planned to walk into, in the careful company of a man who'd never once asked her to be anything other than what she already was. She had learned that she didn't need to earn her right to exist by disappearing. She existed. She was Amara Cole. She was 31 years old and curvy and black and sharper than most rooms could handle and more capable than most people remembered to expect. She was still exactly who she'd always been. The world just had to look at her differently.